I stood at the pickup curb for 3 hours that day, watching every car that wasn't ours pull away with someone else's child. The October wind had turned sharp by the time the last teacher locked the front doors. Mrs. Patterson had asked me twice if I needed to call someone, and twice I had smiled and said my mother was just running late. The third time she asked, I couldn't meet her eyes. She left me a granola bar from her desk drawer and told me the security guard would be inside until 6. I was 12 years old, and I had memorized the pattern of cracks in the sidewalk by the time I finally understood that no one was coming. My phone had died an hour earlier. I had called my mother's number 14 times before the screen went black. Each time, it rang and rang until her voicemail picked up, her recorded voice, cheerful and warm in a way she never was with me. This is Diana. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I can. She could. She simply chose not to. I knew where they were. My sister, Victoria, had a piano recital across town, the kind of event that required both parents in attendance, the kind of event that came with flowers afterward and dinner at the restaurant with the white tablecloths. I had reminded my mother that morning that I needed to be picked up at 3. She had nodded without looking up from Victoria's competition dress, her fingers working a stubborn wrinkle from the silk. I'll be there, she had said. Don't worry, I worried, I always worried, and I was always right to. The security guard found me at 5:30, huddled against the brick wall with my knees pulled to my chest. He was an older man with kind eyes and a daughter my age, and the look on his face when he saw me made something inside my chest crack open. He called my father's office number, the one I had memorized for emergencies, and I listened to him explain the situation in a voice that grew increasingly tight. I couldn't hear my father's response, but I could guess. The guard's expression shifted from concern to something harder, something that looked like anger, held carefully in check. Your dad says someone will be there in 20 minutes, he told me. He didn't say who. It was my mother who finally pulled up in the silver sedan 40 minutes later. The recital had ended. The flowers had been purchased. The reservation had been made and kept. Now, and only now, did she have time to collect the daughter she had forgotten. She didn't apologize when I climbed into the car. She didn't even look at me. Victoria won first place, she said, her voice bright with a pride I had never heard directed at me. The judges said her interpretation was exceptional. Congratulations, I said, because that was what was expected. We drove past the restaurant with the white tablecloths, and I watched through the window as my father and Victoria emerged, laughing, Victoria's trophy catching the streetlight like a small sun. My mother pulled over to collect them, and they slid into the back seat with the smell of expensive food still clinging to their clothes. There she is, my father said, reaching over to ruffle Victoria's hair. Our little star. I turned my face toward the window so no one would see the tears I refused to let fall. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the small room at the back of the house, listening to the sounds of celebration continuing without me. Victoria's laughter, bright and crackless. My father's deep voice, warm with approval. My mother's lighter tones, musical in a way they never were when she spoke to me. I had stopped asking why years ago. The answer was always the same, delivered in 1,000 small cuts. Victoria was exceptional. Victoria was gifted. Victoria was the daughter they had dreamed of, while I was merely the daughter they had. I was the placeholder, the rough draft before the final masterpiece. I existed to make Victoria shine brighter by comparison, to absorb the family's disappointments, so she never had to feel their weight. I closed my eyes and tried to remember a time when it had been different, when my mother's hands had been gentle in my hair, or my father had looked at me with pride. The memories slipped away like water through fingers, too faint to grasp. Perhaps there had never been such a time. Perhaps I had invented it, the way lonely children invent imaginary friends to fill the empty spaces. The years that followed carved themselves into my bones. I learned to become invisible, to move through my own home like a ghost, to expect nothing and receive exactly that. I watched Victoria collect accolades and affection with equal ease, watched my parents' eyes light up every time she entered a room, watched myself fade further and further into the background until I wondered if I would disappear entirely. I was 16 when I met Daniel. He was new to our school, tall and confident with an easy smile that made everyone want to be near him. He sat next to me in chemistry class, and for reasons I never understood, he saw me. Not through me, not past me, but directly at me, as if I were worthy of being seen. I fell in love with him the way a drowning person falls in love with air. For 3 years, he was my everything. He was the only person who remembered my birthday, the only one who noticed when I was sad, the only one who made me feel like I existed in the world as something more than a shadow. I gave him every piece of myself, every fragment I had been saving, every hope I had left. And then I introduced him to my sister. It happened at my 19th birthday party, the small gathering Daniel had insisted on throwing for me despite my protests. Victoria arrived late, beautiful and careless in a way that drew every eye in the room. She barely glanced at me as she entered, her attention caught immediately by the boy at my side. "You must be Daniel," she said, and her smile was a weapon she had long ago learned to wield. I watched something shift in his eyes, something I was too naive to recognize as the beginning of the end. The months that followed were a slow unraveling. Daniel grew distant, his excuses more frequent, his touches more perfunctory. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that our love was strong enough to survive anything. I was wrong. I found them together on the night before my 20th birthday, in the apartment Daniel and I had just signed a lease for. They were tangled in sheets I had picked out. In the bed, I had helped him carry up 3 flights of stairs, and they didn't even have the decency to look ashamed when I walked in. Victoria sat up slowly, her dark hair tumbling over her bare shoulders, and she smiled at me with something that looked almost like pity. "I'm sorry, Lena," she said, and her voice was gentle in a way that made everything worse. "But you had to know this was coming. He was never really yours." I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything that would make this make sense. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His silence said everything his words never had. I walked out of that apartment and never went back. My parents' reaction was worse than their indifference. It was understanding, but not for me. Victoria and Daniel announced their relationship 2 weeks later, and my mother's response was to remind me that I should be happy for my sister. My father suggested I was being dramatic. They looked at me with the same vague irritation they always had, as if my pain were an inconvenience, a disruption to the family harmony that Victoria's happiness deserved. I moved into a small studio apartment on the other side of the city, and I began the slow work of building a life that didn't include any of them. I finished my degree. I found a job at a publishing house, small at first, but with room to grow. I dated occasionally, though I never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. I was 28 when I learned that Victoria and Daniel were engaged. The news came through my mother, who called for the first time in months, specifically to inform me that I would be expected at the engagement party. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention that she hadn't spoken to me since Christmas. She simply delivered her instructions and hung up, leaving me with the dial tone and the familiar ache of not being enough. I went to the party because some part of me still believed that showing up might finally earn their approval. I stood in the corner of my parents' elegant living room, watching Victoria accept congratulations with the same graceful ease she had always possessed, watching Daniel look at her with the adoration he had once directed at me. No one spoke to me for the first hour. No one noticed when I slipped outside to the garden, where the October air was sharp and the stars were hidden behind clouds. I was standing there, breathing slowly, trying to remember why I had come, when I heard Victoria's voice behind me. "You came," she said, and she sounded surprised. "I didn't think you would." I turned to face her. She was beautiful in the moonlight, dressed in white like a bride already, and for a moment I could almost understand why everyone loved her so much. "I didn't want to disappoint Mother," I said. Victoria's expression flickered, something passing behind her eyes too quickly for me to read. She stepped closer, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, meant only for me. "You know, none of this is personal, right?" she said. "Daniel and me, I mean. It just happened. We didn't plan it." I looked at her for a long moment, searching for any trace of guilt or remorse. I found only the same serene confidence she had always worn, the unshakable certainty of someone who had never once doubted their right to take whatever they wanted. "It doesn't matter," I said, and I meant it. I had stopped waiting for apologies years ago. I left the party an hour later, and I didn't say goodbye to anyone. They wouldn't have noticed anyway. The wedding was scheduled for the following spring, and as the months passed, I found myself pulled back into my family's orbit, despite my best efforts. My mother called more frequently now, though the calls were always about Victoria, about the wedding, about the 1,000 small decisions that needed to be made. I was assigned tasks like a servant, expected to help with arrangements I had no interest in, expected to smile through every moment of my own erasure. I did it because I didn't know how to say no. I had never learned. The night before the wedding, I found myself alone in my childhood home, tasked with sorting through old photographs for the reception slideshow. My parents and Victoria had gone to the rehearsal dinner, but no one had thought to invite me. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by boxes of memories, and I looked at photograph after photograph of Victoria. Victoria at her first recital. Victoria winning her first competition. Victoria at graduation, at her college acceptance party, at a dozen events I had no memory of attending. I was absent from almost every picture. When I did appear, I was in the background, out of focus, cut off at the edges. I'd always known I was invisible to my family, but seeing it documented so clearly, so completely, made something inside me go very still. I gathered the photographs I needed for the slideshow, and I didn't let myself cry. I had stopped crying for them years ago. The wedding was beautiful. Everyone said so. Victoria floated down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my annual rent, and Daniel waited for her with tears in his eyes. My parents sat in the front row, glowing with pride, and the guests murmured about how perfect they were together. How lucky, how meant to be. I sat in the back, wearing a dress my mother had chosen for me because she didn't trust my taste. I watched the ceremony with the same detached numbness I had cultivated over years of practice, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, I felt nothing at all. The reception was worse. I had been assigned a seat at a table in the far corner, grouped with distant relatives and family friends, who had been invited out of obligation rather than affection. My mother floated past me once, briefly, to ask why I wasn't mingling. "You should make more of an effort," she said. "People will think something is wrong." "Nothing is wrong," I said, the lie practiced and smooth. She nodded, already looking past me toward Victoria, and then she was gone. I sat at my corner table and watched the wedding unfold like a film I had no part in. I watched Daniel and Victoria dance, watched my father give a toast that mentioned Victoria's accomplishments for 10 minutes and never once acknowledged his other daughter, watched my mother weep with joy as if her heart weren't completely empty when it came to me. And then I watched my glass slip from my numb fingers, watched the red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood, and I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that I couldn't do this anymore. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, but no one noticed. No one ever noticed. I walked out of the reception hall and into the cool night air, and I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew that I couldn't go back. The road was dark and empty, winding through hills I didn't recognize. I must have walked for miles before I saw the headlights, 2 bright points cutting through the darkness like eyes. I heard the horn, a single desperate blast, and then there was light and noise and a pain so vast it erased everything else. And then there was nothing at all. I opened my eyes to a ceiling I had not seen in 17 years. The cracks were exactly as I remembered them, a web of fine lines spreading from the corner where the roof had leaked during my childhood. The water stain was there too, shaped like a rabbit if I squinted just right. I was in my childhood bedroom. I was in my narrow bed under the thin blanket my mother had never bothered to replace, and the clock on my nightstand said 6:47 a.m. The date on my phone said October 15th. The year made no sense at all. I was 12 years old again. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in a chest that felt too small, too young, too impossible. My hands were the hands of a child, unmarked by time and disappointment. My face, reflected in the small mirror on my dresser, was round with baby fat I had long ago lost. I remembered everything. I remembered the wedding and the wine and the walk into the darkness. I remembered the headlights and the horn and the impact that had ended my first life. And I remembered, with perfect clarity, being left at school pickup for 3 hours on this exact day. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of 2 lives pressed down on me, past and present colliding in a way my mind struggled to contain. I gripped the edge of my mattress and forced myself to think, to sort through the chaos of memory and emotion and find something solid to hold on to. I was here. I was alive. I was 12 years old, and I had been given a second chance at a life I had wasted the first time around. The pain of my first life was still there, a dull ache in the centre of my chest, but alongside it was something new, something that felt like clarity, like purpose, like the first breath after nearly drowning. I had spent my entire life waiting for my family to see me, to love me, to choose me even once. I had bent myself into shapes that hurt, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I had given away pieces of myself to people who didn't value them, and I had been left with nothing but the hollow satisfaction of having tried. But I knew now what trying would cost me. I had seen where that path led, and I refused to walk it again. I got out of bed and began to prepare for school with calm, methodical movements. I brushed my hair and packed my bag and ate the breakfast my mother had left on the counter without checking to see if I was awake. I moved through the morning routine like a ghost, but for the first time, the invisibility felt like armour rather than a wound. Today, my mother would forget to pick me up. She would take Victoria to her recital and leave me stranded at school for 3 hours, and she would not apologise when she finally arrived. I knew this because I had lived it before. But this time, I would not wait. At 2:45, 15 minutes before the final bell, I approached Mrs. Patterson's desk and asked to use the phone in the office. She looked at me with mild surprise. I had never asked for anything before. "Is everything all right, Lena?" she asked. "My mother has a conflict this afternoon," I said, my voice steady. "I need to call my aunt to arrange a ride home." The lie came easily. I had no aunt nearby, no one who would come for me, but Mrs. Patterson didn't know that. She nodded and wrote me a pass, and I walked to the main office with a calm I had never possessed at 12 years old. I called no one. I simply waited until the office was empty, slipped out the side door, and began to walk. The route home was 4 miles long, through streets I had not walked alone before. I was 12 and it was not safe, and I should have been afraid. But I had died once already, and somehow that made everything else seem manageable. I arrived home 3 hours before my mother returned with Victoria. The house was empty, the silence almost holy in its completeness. I let myself in with the key hidden under the flower pot that my parents thought no one knew about, and I stood in the foyer of my childhood home with the strange, detached wonder of a ghost revisiting the site of its death. Nothing had changed. The photographs on the walls were still mostly Victoria. My room was still the smallest, tucked away at the back. My mother's car keys were missing from the hook by the door, confirming what I already knew. She had never intended to pick me up at all. I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The favouritism I had accepted as normal now looked grotesque in its obviousness. Victoria's bedroom was twice the size of mine, decorated with furniture that matched and curtains that had been chosen rather than inherited. Her awards lined the shelves of the living room, while my few achievements had been shoved into a box in the basement. I had spent my first life believing I was not good enough. Now I understood that I had simply been assigned that role, cast in a play where I was never meant to be the heroine. But this was a new performance now, and I was rewriting the script. I was in the kitchen, doing homework at the table, when my mother's car finally pulled into the driveway. I heard the doors slam, heard Victoria's voice high and excited, heard my parents' laughter as they made their way inside. They stopped when they saw me. "Lena," my mother said, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or the faint discomfort of being caught. "You're here?" I looked up from my textbook, my expression calm. I walked home. The silence stretched. My father cleared his throat, my mother's lips pressed together in the thin line that meant she was searching for a way to make this my fault. "You should have waited," she said finally. "I was coming to get you." I didn't answer. I simply returned to my homework, and after a moment they moved past me toward the living room, where the celebration of Victoria's victory could continue uninterrupted. But something had shifted. I saw it in the glance my mother threw back at me, in the slight uncertainty in my father's stride. For the first time, I had not reacted as they expected. I had not cried or complained or made my pain their burden to dismiss. I had simply handled things myself, and that small act of independence had unsettled them in ways they couldn't name. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of a household that did not notice my absence. But, for the first time, the silence felt like freedom rather than neglect. I had 17 years of knowledge and a lifetime of pain. I knew exactly what would happen if I continued down the path of my first life, and I knew exactly how to avoid it. I would not beg for love that would never be given. I would not compete with Victoria for attention. I could never win. I would not pour my heart into Daniel or anyone like him, offering pieces of myself to people who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. I would build my own life on my own terms, and I would do it so quietly that no one would notice until it was too late to stop me. The years unfolded differently this time. I focused on my studies with a discipline that had been impossible in my first life, when so much of my energy had gone towards seeking approval that never came. I took advanced classes and earned scholarships, and I told no one about my applications to universities far from home. My parents barely noticed my academic success. They were too focused on Victoria, who had moved from piano to violin to academic competitions, collecting praise like other children collected trading cards. But their lack of attention worked in my favour now. No one questioned where I went after school or what I did with my weekends. No one noticed the part-time job I started at 15, or the savings account I opened with a teacher's help, or the careful research I conducted into colleges that offered full financial aid. I was invisible, and for the first time, I used that invisibility as a weapon rather than a wound. At 16, I met Daniel again. He walked into my chemistry class with the same easy confidence, the same smile that had destroyed me the first time around. He sat next to me, just as before, and he leaned over to introduce himself with a charm that would have melted my younger heart. "I'm Daniel," he said. "You look like someone who actually understands this stuff. Maybe you could help me out?" I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the boy in front of me, but the man he would become. The man who would promise me forever and give me nothing. The man who would look at my sister and decide that I had only ever been a placeholder. "I'm pretty busy," I said, and I turned back to my textbook. I watched his expression flicker, surprise and something like interest crossing his features. No one had ever said no to Daniel before. He wasn't used to being dismissed. "Come on," he said, leaning closer. "I'm not asking for much. Just some tutoring." I met his eyes directly, holding his gaze with a steadiness I had not possessed at 16 the first time around. "You should ask someone who has the time to give," I said. "I don't." I gathered my things and moved to a seat on the other side of the room, and I felt his eyes on my back for the rest of the class. But he didn't approach me again. He found other girls to charm, other hearts to collect, and when he eventually started dating a girl from his English class, I felt nothing but relief. Victoria never met him. The introduction that had destroyed my first life never happened. I graduated at the top of my class, and I did not tell my parents until I had already accepted a full scholarship to a university 3 states away. My mother's reaction was confusion more than anything else. "But Lena," she said, as if the concept were foreign to her, "what about staying close to home? What about helping with Victoria's college applications?" "Victoria is smart enough to handle her own applications," I said, "and I have my own future to build." I left home that summer with 2 suitcases and a heart that had finally stopped waiting for love that would never come. I did not look back as my father's car pulled away from the dormitory curb, and I did not cry when my mother's goodbye was more perfunctory than Victoria's. I had expected nothing, and they had delivered exactly that, but it no longer hurt the way it once had. University was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who knew nothing about my family, who had no preconceptions about who I was or wasn't. I could be anyone here, and I chose to be someone who mattered. I studied hard and made friends carefully, building connections with the people who valued me for who I was, rather than who I failed to be in comparison to my sister. I discovered a passion for writing that had been dormant my entire childhood, smothered under the weight of Victoria's more impressive achievements. I started publishing short stories in literary magazines, building a reputation quietly and consistently. I called home rarely and visited even less. When I did return, usually for holidays I could not avoid, I observed my family with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Victoria had grown more beautiful, more accomplished, more everything my parents had ever wanted. She had boyfriends and admirers and a future that gleamed with promise. My parents looked at her the same way they always had, with the unguarded adoration they had never once directed at me. But I noticed something else now, something I had been too hurt to see the first time around. Beneath Victoria's confidence was a brittleness, a need for constant validation that left her fragile in ways she would never admit. She collected achievements because she didn't know who she was without them. She sought attention because silence felt like rejection. My parents had created her as surely as they had created me. They had made her into a vessel for their ambitions, just as they had made me into a receptacle for their disappointments. We were both products of their limitations, but I had escaped while she was still trapped. I felt something unexpected then, looking at my sister across the Thanksgiving table. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet, distant sadness for the girl she might have been if anyone had loved her for herself rather than her accomplishments. But that was not my problem to solve. I had my own life to build, and I would not sacrifice it for people who had never sacrificed anything for me. I was 25 when my first novel was published. It was a quiet success, the kind that builds slowly through word of mouth and favourable reviews. But it was enough to establish me as a writer worth watching, and it opened doors I had never dared to dream of in my first life. My family heard about it eventually. My mother called, her voice carrying that particular blend of surprise and resentment that I had come to expect. "You wrote a book," she said, as if I had done something faintly embarrassing. "Why didn't you tell us?" "It wasn't relevant to tell," I said. "We don't talk much anyway." "Well," she said, and I could hear her searching for something to criticize. "I hope you're not putting anything too personal in there. You know how private families should be." I assured her that she had nothing to worry about. I had not written about my family at all. They were not interesting enough to put in a novel. I hung up the phone and returned to my work, and I did not think about them again for months. The call about the engagement came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 years later. I was 28 again, the same age I had been when the news had devastated me the first time around. But this version of me was different. This version had a career, a life, a sense of self that did not depend on anyone else's approval. "Your sister is engaged," my mother said, her voice bright with excitement, "to a wonderful young man named Daniel. You'll love him." I paused, the pen in my hand going still. Daniel. I had almost forgotten about him. In this timeline, he was just a name, a face from a chemistry class I barely remembered. He had never been my boyfriend, never been my heart, never been the instrument of my destruction. But he had still found his way to Victoria. "Congratulations," I said, my voice neutral. "When is the wedding?" "Spring," my mother said. "And we expect you to be there, Lena. I know you're busy with your writing, but this is family." "Of course," I said. I wouldn't miss it. I hung up the phone and sat for a long moment in the quiet of my apartment, processing what I had just learned. Daniel and Victoria. Together again, drawn to each other by whatever force had connected them in my first life. Perhaps they were meant to be after all, two people whose need for admiration made them perfect mirrors for each other. I felt nothing. No pain, no jealousy, no anger. Just a faint curiosity about how different things might have been if I had not been there to be hurt the first time around. The wedding was smaller than I expected. I arrived the day before, staying at a hotel rather than my parents' house, and I attended the rehearsal dinner as a peripheral guest. Victoria greeted me with the distant warmth she reserved for relatives she barely knew, and Daniel shook my hand without a flicker of recognition. "It's so nice to finally meet you," he said. "Victoria's told me so much about her sister." He was lying, of course. Victoria had told him nothing. But I smiled and said how nice it was to meet him too, and I watched them together with the clinical detachment of someone observing strangers. They were beautiful together, I had to admit. Beautiful and hollow and perfectly suited to each other. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, and I sat in a middle row rather than the back, wearing a dress I had chosen myself. My mother glanced at me once, her expression flickering with something I couldn't read, but she said nothing. The ceremony was lovely. Everyone said so. Victoria floated down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my first book advance, and Daniel waited for her with tears in his eyes. My parents sat in the front row, glowing with pride, just as they had in my first life. But this time, I watched without pain. I watched without envy or heartbreak or the crushing weight of being left behind. I watched as a witness to something that had nothing to do with me, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, I felt only a quiet satisfaction that I had escaped this fate. The reception was where things diverged. I was not seated in the corner this time. My recent success had elevated my status in my mother's eyes, and I had been placed at a table near the front, among relatives who actually spoke to me. They asked about my writing, about my life, about the awards I had won, and the books I was working on. I answered politely, deflecting attention with practiced ease, and I did not notice Victoria approaching until she was standing beside my chair. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Privately?" I followed her to the garden, to the same spot where we had spoken in my first life. The October air was sharp, and the stars were hidden behind clouds, and for a moment I felt the strange doubling of past and present colliding. "You seem different," Victoria said, studying my face with an expression I had never seen before. "You've always seemed different, actually. For as long as I can remember." I waited, saying nothing. "I used to think you were jealous of me," she continued, and her voice was softer now, stripped of its usual confidence. "Everyone always said you were, that you resented my accomplishments, my success, but you never actually seemed jealous. You just seemed like you were waiting for something." "What do you think I was waiting for?" I asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know," she said, "but whatever it was, I think you found it. You look like someone who found what they were waiting for." I looked at my sister in the moonlight, beautiful in her wedding dress, surrounded by everything she had ever wanted. And I saw for the first time the faint lines of unhappiness around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the hollow uncertainty behind her perfect smile. "I hope your marriage makes you happy," I said, and I meant it. Victoria's expression flickered. "Do you?" she asked. "After everything?" "After everything," I repeated. I smiled, and it was genuine. "You're my sister, Victoria. I want you to be happy. I just know now that your happiness isn't my responsibility, and neither is our parents' love. I spent too many years believing I could earn what was never offered. I don't believe that anymore." She stared at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Then she nodded slowly, and when she turned to go back to her reception, there was a new weight to her steps. I stayed in the garden a little longer, breathing in the cool night air, feeling the peace of a story that had finally found its proper ending. I had spent my first life being forgotten. I had died alone on a dark road, abandoned by everyone who should have loved me, destroyed by a family that had never seen me as worthy of their attention. But this life was different. This life was mine. I walked back into the reception and collected my coat from the check. I said goodbye to no one because there was no one whose goodbye I needed. I stepped out into the night and called a car to take me to the airport, and as the city lights faded behind me, I felt the last threads of my old pain dissolving into something lighter. I had found my own way home. Not to the house where I had grown up, not to the family who had never wanted me, but to the life I had built with my own hands and my own heart and my own stubborn refusal to be invisible any longer. The car moved through the darkness, and I watched the stars emerge from behind the clouds, and I allowed myself to smile. I was going home, and for the first time in either of my lives, I knew exactly where that was. The years that followed were quiet in the way that good years often are. I wrote more books. Some were successful, others less so, but all of them were mine. I travelled to places I had only dreamed of as a child, trapped in a house that didn't want her. I made friends who became family, people who chose me the way I had never been chosen before. I dated carefully and loved cautiously, but eventually I found someone who saw me clearly and loved what he saw. He was nothing like Daniel, nothing like anyone I would have chosen in my first life. He was steady where I had once craved excitement, kind where I had once mistaken intensity for passion. We built a life together, slow and deliberate, and when we married, my family was not invited, not out of spite, but simply because they had no place in the life I had created. I heard about them occasionally, through relatives who felt obligated to share news. Victoria and Daniel had children, a boy and a girl who appeared in photographs looking beautiful and uncertain. My parents grew older, their pride in Victoria beginning to calcify into something more complicated, as her marriage revealed its cracks. Daniel, it seemed, had a wandering eye, just as he had in my first life, just as he would have had if I had been foolish enough to marry him. Victoria's perfect life was not so perfect after all, and my mother's phone calls to me grew more frequent, more desperate, as if she was finally recognising that the daughter she had ignored might have been worth something all along. I did not return her calls, not out of cruelty, but out of a recognition that some bridges cannot be rebuilt once they have burned. I had given my family every chance to love me in 2 lifetimes. I had waited at school pickups and sat at corner tables and watched from the edges of photographs, hoping that one day they would turn and see me standing there. They never had. And I had finally accepted that they never would. On the 20th anniversary of my rebirth, I stood at the window of the house my husband and I had built together, watching our children play in the autumn leaves. They were laughing, bright and careless in the way children should be, and I felt a swell of love so fierce it took my breath away. I had given them what I never had, attention that didn't need to be earned, love that didn't come with conditions, a mother who saw them, who chose them, who would never leave them, waiting at a school curb wondering if they mattered. The phone rang, and my husband answered it in the other room. I heard his voice, low and careful, and then he appeared in the doorway with an expression I recognized. "It's your mother," he said. "She wants to speak to you." I turned back to the window, watching my children, feeling the weight of 2 lifetimes settle gently on my shoulders. "Tell her I'm not available," I said. "Tell her I'll call back when I can." I never did. The sun was setting over the garden, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and my children's laughter echoed through the trees like music. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, filling the spaces that had once been hollow with something that felt like peace. I had found my own way home, and I was finally, completely, irrevocably free.